If you're like me, you've probably come across Bluebescuits tutorials on YouTube and thought their messy art style is somehow still very pretty. So of course, you'd want to study from their art. They already have a multitude of tutorials up on their channel, so in this video I'll break down what I've learned about their art style from these videos and try to summarize the videos into one main video. I'll also show how to implement parts that I like into my own art style. I'll also be studying from these drawings I found on their Instagrams. Before you start any art study, I think it's important to hone in on what you really want to focus on. So you probably have a very specific part of the artist's art style that you really like and would really like to replicate in your own art style. So in my case, this would be the way they do their line art and rendering. So in my studies, I'll be focusing pretty heavily on how they do these two things, on top of everything else that goes into their art style. Okay, first let's start with the proportions of the face. Just note that of course not all these proportions are exactly the same every single time, but it does give a very general baseline for you to use. Okay, so unlike most artists who I think often have kind of like 2 or 3 different set face types that they use, or just kind of like one general sizing system they use, I think Blue actually has a much wider range of faces they use in their art. So sometimes, for instance, the eyes will be 1 eye apart, and other times they'll be half an eye apart. Sometimes the face is a bit shorter, and other times it's a bit longer. It definitely varies a lot, which I think helps the characters look a lot more distinct from each other. But from what I could tell, I think the face can be broken down sometimes into 3 chunks, which are the size of the eyes and the eyebrows combined, usually when the eyes are very big. And other times, if you combine the eyes and the eyebrows when the eyes are rather small, then they divide the face up into 5 parts instead. Honestly, I think if you struggle with same face syndrome, I think Blue has a wide array of faces, so I definitely recommend studying their faces. But anyways, when it comes to their eyes, they also use very thick top eyelashes while having the bottom be very thin, and sometimes it just gets painted over entirely and you can't see it at all. The eye shapes also vary, but they seem to mainly use these smaller angled eyes or these big round eyes. The pupils themselves are actually often closer to a rectangular shape, which I think is rather interesting compared to the normal very round eyes that artists often use. They use the rectangular shape to help make sure that their eyes are facing the right direction, which I think is a pretty neat trick. Okay, and lastly for the nose, they often either go with the anime nub, use lines to define a more unique shape, or they rely on shading to give the nose a shape outside of the typical anime nubs. When it comes to the proportions of the body, they really kind of use the same standard anime proportions, so I really won't go into them here, but they do have videos about how they draw their bodies if you're curious. Okay, for the line art, they use a brush called Soul, which you can find for free on their Ko-Fi. They've made the brush available for multiple programmings, including like Loop Studio, Procreate, Krita, and I think Ibis Paint. But if you want to just recreate it yourself, it actually isn't that hard to recreate. It's basically just a round brush that stays more or less one size, using the pressure to change the opacity of the stroke rather than the size of the stroke. The opacity also isn't set to full opacity by default, so it gives a very interesting layering effect when drawing the line art. And also you have to make sure that the pen or whatever isn't set to be able to blend with the layers underneath, it just simply sits on top of them. From what I could tell, they mainly stick to kind of just one size for the brush for most of the piece. The line work is also rather messy, instead looking much closer to a sketchy style, which I personally really like. And unlike some art styles which add a thicker line art or outline to the characters, they don't seem to really do that, and instead just further adjust the line art as they need in the rendering stage, including painting over any messy or straight lines that they don't want and thinning out any thick lines. They also often use a very dark red, brown, or purple instead of pure black for the final piece. Rendering is definitely what gave me the most trouble, as I'm really not that good at color theory, while they clearly have a very strong foundation in it. So I'll do my best to share what I understood, but I also recommend watching their videos on color theory if you struggle like me. Overall, they use a more muted color palette, and I think interestingly enough, they use rather beige whites for their eyes and mouth. I also use muted colors and don't use pure whites, but their whites are actually just a lot more beige or gray than you'd originally think. When it comes to the overall base color palette, they try to stick to colors close to each other on the color wheel for the most part, and this helps in choosing colors that automatically look nice together. When it comes to shading for the shadows, they'll actually pick the base color and then move down and to the right and move the hue closer to wherever blue is on the color wheel. This means that instead of making the shadows more desaturated like a lot of artists do, they're actually making them more saturated, which I think is rather interesting and probably why the coloring still looks vibrant despite using primarily muted colors. Also, the amount you move by increases the more you want that to be the focal point, where there will be more detail. So for instance, oftentimes the focal point in an art piece is oftentimes the face. So in the face, they'll move the color over by bigger amounts to make it stand out more compared to something like the body or like the clothes, which you might want to blend in more, use less detail, so the amount you adjust the color by will be a lot smaller. But do note that for dark colors like black, they do more minimal shading normally since it's already so dark. For lighting, it's kind of the same thing, but backwards, and I think from what I could tell, they seem to use overlays more often to do their lighting rather than just adjusting colors. In Clip Studio, I'm pretty sure they use the layers called Add and Add Glow most of the time. Also, I think sometimes they use like the overlay layer. But of course, you can mess with different blend modes based on whatever art program you're using. Once that's all down, they'll often mix in some complementary colors where they see fit. From what I can tell, the complementary colors are mainly used in the shadow areas rather than the light areas, although I imagine this probably adjusts or changes based on what you want for the entire piece. But as a basis, they seem to mainly use the complementary colors to further accentuate the shadows. During this process, they'll do the base coloring under the line art and then the more fine tuning over the line art. They sometimes change the line art color by simply painting over it, or they'll set the line art to alpha and change its original color in certain sections. They'll often adjust the line art colors based on the colors of the line art it's touching, and this is especially true for the skin. The line art touching the skin is often just a darker and redder version of the base skin tone. When doing the eyes, the eyelashes are often painted over to a mix of like a dark red with a hint of blue. Also, the pupils seem to lose most of the line art as most of the details are painted over. Sometimes they'll mix complementary colors into the colors of the pupils, which helps make them stand out more, but other times they just use basically the same system they use for coloring everywhere else, where they use 3 to 4 colors to black out the pupils, with either white or a strong complementary color to give them some life. They also add some blush under the eyes and on the nose, but unlike most artists, they don't actually blend it out, they just lower the opacity of the layer. And in fact, most of the shading is done this way. There's very minimal blending, instead they rely on shapes. At the end, they'll use what I think is kind of like a tealish or a very bright blue color and add some random lines with it across the piece. I really don't know the rhyme or reason as why they do this. It seems, or kind of like why they choose where they place it. It seems to be just kind of random and is really just kind of based on vibes of where you think it would look good. For the final finishing touch, they'll use a light color like yellow and use an airbrush to put it over the face and set the layer to glow and lower the opacity. This helps bring focus to the face and can be used in other areas that you want the viewer to focus on, like maybe like the hands or something you're holding, etc. And at the very, very end, I don't know if they do this all the time, but they do say that sometimes they will use gradients over top to add in some final touches and further bring the colors all together. Okay, so when it comes to the master copies, I, as always, like to do one where I trace the line work, as this helps me kind of notice very specific details about the line art that I might have missed otherwise, and also allows me to focus more on the rendering side. So as you can see here, I was really just tracing over this guy since I thought the drawing came out pretty nice. I liked how messy it looked, so I made good use of line work references as well as rendering references, and this is where I really start to get the hang of kind of like the method at which they're coloring, because I never color in this method, so it was definitely kind of hard, but this is kind of really where I started to kind of figure out. But yeah, I definitely do think it came out pretty good in the end. Okay, after the initial copy, this is where I do another master copy, but I don't trace anything. This is where I now focus more on proportions and how to kind of copy the proportions and the way they stylize everything. So as you can see, this is basically where we have pretty similar styles, so it wasn't too weird for me. They do have pretty big eyes like TBHK, and since I drew big eyes in TBHK, I'm a little bit more used to the shapes of the eyes now. I will say that the hand probably gave me the biggest trouble. Like, it came out like okay, but I still feel like it looks a little wonky. The coloring was definitely a little bit harder because there's definitely, I feel like, more unique coloring going on than in the previous one. So that was definitely a challenge. I don't think I got it totally correct, but I think overall it's close enough and it's not bad. This is also where I figured out more about the way they change the color of the line work. Okay, so unlike last time where I drew a separate drawing for both the copy of like where I'm doing just a completely unique drawing with their style, and then a different copy or a different like implementation of implementing what I liked from their art style into my art style, I kind of just used one piece for both. Since we have pretty similar art styles, I knew that there wouldn't be any like super major differences in terms of like proportions or anything like that, so I decided to just kind of mix them into one. So here, the vast majority of this speed paint will be drawing in the Bluebescuits style. So here I was using their original brush that they use and everything, and I was also keeping in mind their proportions, but again, we have decently similar proportions, so that wasn't too hard. I did change the eye shape of the character to match something that Bluebescuits would use more, and I actually ended up keeping this in the implementation version. Since I'm kind of interested in this eye shape, I might keep it for his final character design, we'll see. But obviously, in case it wasn't obvious, the biggest challenge was definitely the coloring. I'm really not good at color theory, but I tried to keep in mind what they said in their videos about how they manage their colors, and I think when I went back and did that, I actually got a lot better results in terms of the colors and everything. So considering that I really don't think I'm very good at color theory or kind of understanding shading and things like that, I'm actually pretty happy with how this came out. I would say that I think the biggest differences between their version and kind of my version is, number one, I changed the eye a little bit. In their version, their eye is more rectangular shape, or I make it a rectangular shape by the end. And then in my version, I stick to a more rounder shape. I also use different colors in his eyes, as well as in TBHK, you might remember where we learned about like, these little edges they put across their eyes. I've been experimenting with keeping that in my style, so I also include that in this one. And then the other thing I changed was the brush. I like the brush, but I wanted to try this brush. Okay, so if you saw my last one, then you'll know that I've been experimenting with hard brushes as well, like they do in anime a lot of the time. But originally, normally I would kind of use something that's a bit similar to Bluebescuits brush, but it's a little bit different. It tapers, and the opacity differences isn't as intense. So I did also use that brush. I changed the line art to do that brush instead to see what it would look like, and I also gave the character an outline. I also gave the character a thicker outline, as well as the head and the hands gave a little bit of a thicker outline. And yeah, overall, I think they both came out pretty neat, and I'm pretty happy with both of them. Okay, and that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed the video and hopefully it was helpful. Again, like I said, they have tons of tutorials going into deeper depth into their art style on their channel, but this is just kind of like a summary of all of the most important bits that I found from their videos. I also posted a Toleban Hanako-kun art style video last week, and then I also plan on doing one for Tamika, Tricky Wagon, Valency, Kuro, and a ton of other artists. If there are any other artists that you would like to see specifically, tell me down in the comments below and I'll try to add them to the list. Make sure to like the video if you found it helpful, subscribe if you would like to see more art style videos in the future, and I also post a lot of character design and sketchbook videos as well on my channel. And yeah, I will see you guys next time, hopefully. Okay, bye-bye.